Howdy, it's Kyle talking about the top 20 must-see places in the U.S. I've had the opportunity to drive around the contiguous U.S. many times. I've been to all of the major and medium-sized cities, most of them several times. I've been to almost all of the cities in the country with over 50,000 people and almost all of the nature-based national parks. And here I want to go over what I think are the top 20 must-see places in the country. Because the country is so large, there's just so much variety in what you can see. So in the 20 that I chose, 10 are cities and 10 are more natural type areas, because just all this variety here, you can't see it all. But I think in the 20 that I chose, it really covers a wide spectrum of things you can see across this huge country. And if you are interested in a beautiful map like this, it's made by Mirrorway Maps. Check out the link in the description for a coupon code. But yeah, let's talk about the top 20 must-see places in the contiguous U.S. I'm going to start off by going over the must-see cities, which of course means New York first. It's the largest and most vibrant city in the country. There's just so much stuff to do. There are so many great neighborhoods to visit, and you can walk around a lot of it, take the subway. Where else can you do 500,000 things all by $2 to $3? And it isn't just the touristy type stuff either. You can go to Times Square for an hour or two, check that out. But it's also just some of, again, the other neighborhoods, other interesting parts of town, going across the river to Brooklyn and Queens, some of the really interesting immigrant neighborhoods, ethnic enclaves. So there's much more to New York than just Manhattan, but you definitely want to see Manhattan, and I certainly think that New York City is one that every American has to see. At the opposite end of the country, I'm going to have to mention San Francisco. Similar to Manhattan, there's just so much to see in a small area. So it's a really tight, compact city. You can walk around a lot. The neighborhoods change frequently. There's just so many really cool neighborhoods to see, just so much variety to see in a small area. And similar to Manhattan, it isn't just the touristy stuff. Do the touristy stuff, but also check out some of the more off the beaten path neighborhoods and parks all throughout the city. It's a wonderful place to explore. Going into the Midwest, another must-see big city is Chicago. I think from a pure downtown perspective, this one is better than either New York or San Francisco. I think those cities, the best neighborhoods are not downtown. But for Chicago, I think the heart of the city is the CBD. You can make a pretty good argument that the architecture in Chicago's downtown is more interesting than the one in Manhattan, even though there aren't as many skyscrapers. It isn't quite as walkable as New York or San Francisco, but you can walk around quite a bit, and there are a lot of other really interesting neighborhoods all throughout the town that aren't just the downtown, and not just some of the touristy areas like Wrigleyville, but a lot of really other cool, very interesting neighborhoods. Another must-see city, I think, for Americans is Boston. I think it has the most interesting historical neighborhoods of all the big cities in the U.S., a really nice waterfront, a lot of interesting neighborhoods that are close to each other because the city is relatively compact. You have the suburb of Cambridge, also very historic. It's often considered one of America's finest cities, and I'm not exactly sure what that means, but I agree. Another city that I think is a must-see is Washington, D.C. It's not just for the nation's capital type things like the mall and the Smithsonian museums, but also like the other cities I mentioned, a lot of really cool neighborhoods. It is pretty walkable, but it also has a really nice metro system that can get you to other parts of the city that you might not want to walk to. Also, just across the Potomac River is Alexandria, Virginia, a really nice old town historic district. So whether or not you're interested in seeing the mall and the monuments, I do think Washington is a must-see city for Americans. Going to the far southeast of the U.S., another must-see city is Miami. And like the other cities I mentioned, this is a one-of-a-kind. There's nothing quite like Miami. It's got that subtropical heat and humidity. It's always sunny and hot, but it isn't quite as bad as the more central and northern parts of Florida. It has a great food scene. It's heavily influenced by Cuba and other parts of the Caribbean and just Latin America in general. So you can go on down there and have a pina colada underneath a neon sign while watching half-naked people dance until 4 in the morning. Or you can be like me and just enjoy the cultural stuff and the food and be in bed by 10. Another city I think that is a must-see is Pittsburgh. This might be a bit of a surprise. You don't often hear of Pittsburgh being a big tourist draw. And the reason why I like Pittsburgh so much is that it has so many unique neighborhoods very close to each other due to the geography of the city. You have the hills and mountains keeping two different type neighborhoods separated so they each have their own identity, but it's really easy to walk between the two and you get a pretty good exercise doing so. So I think Pittsburgh is the most interesting of the quote-unquote normal cities in the U.S. and one I think all Americans should visit. And now, perhaps my most unpopular take in the video, I do think a must-see city for people is New Orleans. And yeah, I know a lot of people really hate New Orleans, but just like the other cities I mentioned, it's a one-of-a-kind. So just like Miami, it has a very interesting and unique food culture, has an interesting culture with the French history and heritage. And just from a food, music, and architecture angle, I think New Orleans is a must-visit. And you'll definitely want to see the French Quarter. I think the best time to see it is a weekday morning, like 9 a.m. or so. So none of the stores are open yet. It's nice and quiet. You can check out the architecture, and all the drunks have gone home. So yeah, it usually gets a bad rap, but for better or worse, there's nothing else quite like New Orleans. Another must-see city for people, I think, is Charleston, South Carolina. This is much smaller than the other cities I mentioned, but certainly worth a visit. A really nice, well-preserved historic district with no high-rise buildings. So you have the area called the Battery with all the huge old homes. You have areas along King Street, some nice shopping. And it really is a wonderful city to walk around, at least the peninsula part of it with all those old buildings and those beautiful trees. But being right there on the coast, it also has wonderful seafood and some beautiful beaches on sea islands. For my wife and I, it's one of our favorite cities, and we love visiting there, and we think you will too. So that's why I think Charleston, South Carolina is a must-see. And the last must-see city, I think, in the U.S. is Santa Fe, New Mexico. And it's certainly no surprise that I put Santa Fe on a list like this, but I do think it is a must-see. Like all the other places I mentioned, it's a one-of-a-kind place. There's nothing else quite like this. The history, the architecture. And there are other parts of New Mexico that do have that architecture and some history, but not anywhere near as much as Santa Fe. And kind of like Miami and New Orleans, a big reason why you want to go there is that food. I love walking around the square and the greater historic district around there, as well as visiting some of the art galleries. But it's also a small enough city to where you can get out of the city very easily into the mountains onto a nice hike with good views of the city. Santa Fe is the oldest European settlement in the U.S. after St. Augustine, Florida, and I think is a must-see. So those are the cities I think that are must-sees. You get a good variety of the U.S. as a whole by visiting those 10. But now I want to talk about some of the beautiful natural sights you can see in the contiguous U.S. I'm going to start with the most cliche one, and that's the Grand Canyon in Arizona. But there's a reason why it's so cliche. It is huge and it's beautiful. Most people visit by just driving along the main road and stopping at some of the viewpoints to get a photo and then get back into the car to the next viewpoint. But I think the best way to visit the Grand Canyon is just to park your car somewhere and then follow the rim trail for as long as you want. I think you get way more out of it that way. I think you get also more out of it doing that than just doing the day where you hike all the way down to the bottom and back up to the top. I like the different viewpoints and vantage points of you following the rim trail, but that's up to each person's personal preference. But whether you're a casual national park visitor or you're a hardcore backpacker, you definitely want to see the Grand Canyon. The other cliche, but cliche for a reason, park you'll want to visit is Yellowstone. It'll be packed, there'll be a bunch of people in most parts of the park you go to, but it'll still be worth it. So you will want to see the most well-known parts of the park, some of the places where it's going to be the busiest, but there are certain places where you can go where even in the high season there might not be that many people. So for example, the last time we were there was May 2017, and that was a pretty busy time for the park, but at the Norris Geyser Basin there were very few people. So if you want to see some beautiful volcanic and geologic formations plus some beautiful mountains, you'll definitely want to see Yellowstone. Another must-see national park, I believe, is Olympic National Park in Northwest Washington. Similar to how New York and San Francisco and Pittsburgh have many changing neighborhoods over a short distance, Olympic National Park is a similar type thing for parks. It has 3 very distinct parts. You have the high Olympic Mountains themselves, you have the beautiful Hoh rainforest, the temperate rainforest, and also that gorgeous coastline. I don't think there are any other national parks that gives you this much variety in this short of a distance. You can literally hike on a volcano one day, then hike through a beautiful green temperate rainforest the next day, each night camping on the beach. The next national park that I think is a must visit is Bryce Canyon in southwest Utah. I think Bryce has what I would call the easiest scenery in the country. You can drive along the main road through the park, kind of like the Grand Canyon, and just stop at some of the viewpoints. But if you don't go in the summer, it will be much less busy and you're very close to some of these gorgeous spots. You can do really short hikes down into the canyon, much easier than going down into the Grand Canyon. So Bryce is a great national park for people that have limited mobility. If you're elderly or disabled, you can see quite a bit of fantastic scenery without getting very far out of your car. But it's also a great national park for people that are more hardcore that want to go backpacking for several days. So if you're going to do the Grand Circle National Park circuit throughout the Southwest, you're probably going to visit at least 2 or 3 of the national parks in Utah, but if you could only visit one, my choice would be Bryce. Another one I think all people should see is close to where I'm from, that's Sequoia Kings Canyon National Park in Central California. Everybody knows Yosemite National Park up the road, and everybody goes there. Significantly fewer people go to Sequoia Kings Canyon with the same beautiful scenery. It's much easier to get away from crowds. There's a tremendous backcountry if you want to get way back there. It's a park where it can be a relatively leisurely visit where you just visit the big trees areas and a couple of the really short day hikes. But there is a massive backcountry. You can get way back there, get super lost if you want. So yes, I'm biased. I grew up about 45 minutes away from Sequoia National Park, and I've been there a million times. But in my opinion, if you're only going to visit either Yosemite or Sequoia, go to Sequoia. Staying in the west, going back to New Mexico, I think all people should see Carlsbad Caverns National Park. I think visiting a cave is a must-see for people, and I think the one that's the best for visitors is Carlsbad. You walk this incredibly long trail all the way down into the depths of the cave, and you can take a leisurely walk at your own pace around this big room. It's literally called the Big Room. And obviously the stuff you're going to see in a cave is going to be completely unlike things you're going to see on the surface. And if you go in the off season and go early in the morning, so you're one of the first people down there, you can have that whole big room to yourself pretty much. And if you go in the summer times, at dusk is the huge bat flight of Mexican free-tailed bats. I know a lot of folks are afraid of caves and bats, but I do think seeing a cave is a must-see, and Carlsbad is the one I would recommend first. Another must-see national park, and one that's off the beaten path, is Teddy Roosevelt National Park in western North Dakota. And it is very easy to get peace and quiet, solitude in this national park. You don't have to walk very far from the parking lot to get to complete peace and solitude. The scenery is gorgeous, it's subtle beauty, but it just goes on forever. And you'll also see a ton of wildlife here, a lot of bison, prairie dogs, bald eagles, and wild horses. We've been to this park multiple times and have had the park to ourselves each time. It's off the beaten path, it's one of the least visited national parks in the contiguous U.S., and I highly recommend it, Teddy Roosevelt National Park in western North Dakota. Another must-see natural region are the Great Smoky Mountains straddling Tennessee and North Carolina. The national park, especially in the summer and fall, can be super crowded, but once you get outside of the park, you can still be on some of these beautiful back roads, see the same gorgeous scenery without the crowds. Most people go in the fall for the fall foliage. It is beautiful, but if you go in the spring, it's just as beautiful with the green, but the waterfalls are flowing like crazy, and these are some of the most plentiful waterfalls in the country. So if you've seen the national parks of the West, beautiful exposed geology, but it's often brown or colored. It might be beautiful, but when you go to the southeast, you can see these beautiful mountains covered in all this green. You'll definitely want to see the Great Smoky Mountains. Another off-the-beaten-path national park that I think is definitely a must-see is Congaree National Park in South Carolina. Kind of like caves, people often forget about swamps. People don't like them, but I do think this is a beautiful sight to see and really easy to visit. Within 100 yards of the parking lot, you're on this boardwalk path that goes on for a few miles. You're going through some deep swamp. When it's flooded, the elevated parts will be walking over water, but usually it's not flooded. But there are also certain parts of the park where you're not on an elevated boardwalk, you're just walking along the dirt. There will be very few people around. You can just stop and sit and just enjoy the sounds of the swamp. And it gets its name because the Congaree River flows right through it, and you can paddle through it in a canoe or kayak starting from Columbia going down through the park. I love this national park. I went there a bunch of times when I was living in Columbia, and I do think it is a must-see place for Americans. And the last natural spot I'm going to mention as a must-see is not a national park, but a national forest, and that's Superior National Forest and the Boundary Waters Canoe Area in northern Minnesota. This is just thick, dense northwoods, beautiful green scenery, and a ton of lakes. As you might expect with a name like the Boundary Waters Canoe Area, it's an area meant to be paddled around, and there's plenty of paddling options. But if you don't have a boat, don't want to paddle, there's plenty of things you can see on foot as well. Beautiful hikes through the forest and beautiful vantage points on a mountain looking over Lake Superior. And just a very different mountain and nature experience than what you might expect in the big national parks of the West or in the Southeast. I think seeing the dense north woods of the upper Midwest is a really cool thing for all people to see. And I think the most must-see part of that whole region is the part of Minnesota, Superior National Forest, and the Boundary Waters. So that was my look at the top 20 must-see places in the U.S. And of course, these are just my opinion. There's going to be differing opinions on what people think are the most important things to see. But I think with the ones I chose, with just so much variety in the U.S., it really covers a wide spectrum of cities and natural areas. But if you enjoyed this video, please give me a thumbs up to let me know you approve, and subscribe to this channel if you're interested in learning more about geography from a nerd. But yeah, thanks for watching. Geography King signing out. I'd like to give a special thanks to my Superior patrons for their support, especially Maribel. Thank you very much for joining. Welcome to the club. If you're interested in supporting the channel, you can check out my Patreon page. The link is in the description. As always, thank you very much.